We're going to be in Colossians 3 today. We're going to do the first small portion of Colossians 3 this week, and then we'll go through as much of the rest of Colossians 3 next week. All right, so if you remember kind of what's been happening in Colossians thus far, we talked a lot about, last week we dealt with a lot of debated topics, potential background for this Colossian. Some people, it's often called the Colossian heresy. That word is not used in the text, but it's some kind of teaching that had come into the Colossian church. It looks to be, it has some kind of a Jewish influence with it. But there also may be some kind of a pagan influence as well with it. So if you go back up into chapter 2, you see language of this teaching where he says, "Let no one condemn you or judge you with food or drink or by some kind of a festival or new moon or Sabbath." And these are just shadows of the things to come, right? But then he goes on and says, so let no one judge you, and then let no one condemn you, wishing for you to take part in this, some kind of false humility. And we mentioned that this word humility, in some contexts of religious practice, can refer to fasting. And oftentimes, especially in pagan contexts, people would fast as they prepared for some kind of visionary experience. And so that may be what's going on here. So some kind of false humility. And then you also have this language of the worship of angels. And so we talked a little bit about last week how that could either mean that they were actually worshiping the angels. There were people around their context who were paying special homage to angels. Or, depending upon how you read it, and this is debated, of course, it could be that they would be participating with the angels worshiping God. So it's some kind of visionary experience where they're being caught up into some kind of spiritual heavenly reality, worshiping alongside the angels in some kind of a temple complex. So different scholars debate this. Some think it has more to do with a pagan influence where they're actually worshiping the angels, whereas others think that what could be happening is that much of the problem in this area has to do with a misunderstanding of the temple. And we see a lot of temple language here. And so some think that Paul's major argument to the book of Colossians is showing Jesus to be the temple. It's not in this Jewish mysticism. It's not in this false teaching. It's Jesus is the temple, and we're supposed to worship Jesus. Okay? Whatever that may be, the major point, however you parse all that out, okay, this is scholarly jargon. The major point here, though, is found at the end of that little section right here where it says, and not, this is verse 19, look at 2:19, and not holding on to the what? The head, from whom the whole body, right, is, connected, right? And it grows the growth of God. So whatever the problem was, okay, whether this be Jewish or pagan or a little bit of both, however they're falling by the wayside, what's the point? What are they not doing? They're not appreciating Christ as the major source of authority. They're not appreciating Christ as the source of growth for the body. Right? Now, I don't think here at New Providence we struggle with Jewish mysticism. I don't think we're struggling with Jewish pagan practices. But every church at some point in their life is going to struggle with making sure Christ is the head. Right? It's an authority problem. There is an authority issue here. And I think that's the point that we're supposed to take home. So, verse 20, if indeed you have died with Christ, apart from the elementary things of the world, why are you being dogmatized as though you're living by the world? All right? So Verse 20, what's that first word of verse 20? Therefore. Do y'all have therefore? Okay. Colossians 2:20. Yeah. Do y'all have all since? Okay, that's really good. Okay, so here sometimes you have conditional sentences in the Bible where you start the sentence with if, right? That's what a conditional is. If you clean your room, I'll give you extra dessert. If you keep your tires, if you change your oil, your engine will not shut down, right? This is a condition, right? The condition is I do this thing such that my car won't break down. Okay, sometimes conditional sentences can be rhetorical, though. So let's say I phrased a sentence like this. If Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time, ellipsis, ... What do I mean by that? Am I sowing doubt about Michael Jordan? Does anybody see what I'm doing there? I'm actually assuming that to be true, right? If in fact Michael Jordan is the best basketball player on earth, what would be some logical conclusions we could make from that? He must have shot a bunch of baskets, or he must have had a bunch of dunks, or maybe most simplistically, if it's the case that Michael Jordan is the best basketball player to have ever lived, ... that must mean everybody else is inferior, So sometimes you can use an if to mean because, right? Because, notice it this way, because Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player to ever live, everybody else is inferior, right? So sometimes you can start the sentence with if, but notice that all of your translations in 220 say therefore, right? Wherefore, therefore, or if. Oh, yours says if? Okay, good. So that's following the structure a little better, but it's because it means because. Okay, so read it that way. Since you have died with Christ, apart from the elementary principles of the world, why are you what's happening? Why are you what? Why are you doing what? Yeah, why do you still belong to the world, right? Okay, so if you look up back in further up in chapter 2, way up in chapter 2, maybe verse 11, it says, in whom you were also circumcised with the circumcision not made by hand, with the removal of the body of flesh, with the circumcision of Christ, having been what with him? What's happened with him or in him? You were buried with him in baptism, in whom you were also raised through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. Okay, so if you have been buried and raised, what does that assume? Verse 20. See how verse 20 assumes something really important? Okay, that you've been baptized. That you have died. That's exactly right. What'd you say? And now it assumes that you're alive, certainly. But to the point, both of you are right, by the way. But to Robert's point, it's that you have died. So Paul is using language that he's already said to say, hey, you have died to the world's influence, right? And so verse 20 again, if you've died with Christ, all right? So notice the way you could phrase this. If you've died with Christ, and it's almost like Paul's saying, and you have, right? You know how sometimes when you would have to write a paper, you'd have to put things in parentheses, those little brackets to make a parenthetical comment? So that's kind of what he's doing there. He's like, if you've died with Christ, and guess what? You have, then here's what we're supposed to do about it, right? Okay, we're setting up what's happening. So we're gonna skip the last part of the section, but this is where I want us to really hone in on. You have died with Christ apart from the elementary principles of the world, and if that's the case, and it is, why do you still belong to the world, right? Okay, chapter 3, go down to chapter 3. This is where I want us to start. So what's going to happen here is we're going to start off with some assumptions that are made that connect us to a lot of things that Paul has already said, to really hone in the point, because later in the text he's going to start making ethical applications, right? So he's going to basically make this point. Here's some big things that God has done in your life, right? He has taken your sins away and nailed them to the cross. Remember that from chapter 2, verse 14? And when you died, you were put to death, and then you were raised back to new life, right? So you were raised with Christ, right? And where was Christ risen? Yeah, where is he now? Yeah. Okay, so think of this is resurrection language, and if you've been raised with Christ, that must mean that you are currently in a status related to where Christ is, with God, in communion with God, as well as over the spiritual forces of evil. That's a big theme that we should think about. So not only have we been raised to life, but we are raised to a status like that of Christ Jesus. Victorious, conquering evil powers under our feet, right? Okay, so if therefore, chapter 3, verse 1, do y'all have just therefore, or do y'all have if therefore? If therefore? If then, okay, this is the same kind of condition that's made back in chapter 2, verse 20. Because he says, if therefore you've been raised with Christ, is there any doubt that you've been raised here? Is this meant to doubt that you've been raised? No, it's actually to hone in the point. He's like, yes, ma'am. That's exactly what it means. That's exactly what it means. Since you have been raised, okay, so there's a special class of conditionals that this follows, and it's not to be like, oh, maybe if. It's actually to hammer the point that you have been raised, okay, and we've already established this from chapter 2. So if you've been raised with Christ, let's read this and then we'll talk about it. If you've been raised with Christ, and that means the Messiah. If you've been raised with the Messiah, seek the things above, right? And what's the logical conclusion that he makes in the second half of that sentence? Yeah, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And then you have a second imperative in verse 2. So we're told to seek the things that are above, and now we're told to think about the things above, not the things on earth. For you have died, okay, and your life is hidden with Christ in God, period, or semicolon. Whenever Christ is revealed, who is your life, whenever Christ, who is your life, appears, then you yourselves also will be revealed with him in glory. Okay, so let me see if I can summarize this a couple of different ways. One way we could say it is, believers should seek heavenly things and not old earthly things, because they have died to the old world and have been raised with Christ as a new creation in the heavenly world, in a new heavenly world. That's one way of summarizing it from G.K. Beale. Another way you could summarize it is by saying, this serves as a pivotal point in the letter by summing up some of the main ideas presented in the first two chapters, and by providing an introductory basis for the ethical teaching that will follow. So the teaching that will follow that says, here's how you live, here's how you talk, here's how you walk, here's how you think, here's how you treat your neighbor, here's how you live the Christian life, is all predicated on this section, right? And the sections that come previous to this, okay? And then one last way we could say it. Having argued that the Colossians have been set free from the powers, did you hear that language of elementary principles? We'll say it's the influence of the world. We'll say that. Having argued that the Colossians have been set free from the powers of the world, Paul now contends that they have been set free for living a life above moral reproach. Okay? So the language a minute ago was you've been set free from the world, from the elementary things. You've been totally set free from the bondage and corruption of the world. And now you have been set free for a particular purpose, And that's going to be what we see in the back half of chapter 3 and then going into 4 as well. Okay, so we mentioned several assumptions. So what are the assumptions that he's made so far in chapter 3? Assumptions that he assumes are true that will... Yeah, you have died and you have been raised. You have died and you have been raised. You have died and you have been raised. And those things are final, right? So you've died and you've been raised. Notice also, how many times, does anybody see how many times the word Christ is used in this passage? Anybody want to count them? Just from verses 1 to 4. Chapter 3, 1 to 4. It's at least 4 or 5. I think it's 5. Yeah. This title, Christ is not a name, by the way. Christ is a title. It means Messiah. And Messiah means, anybody know? Anointed king. Messiah means anointed king. Okay, that's just the Old Testament word for Christ. So, since you've been raised, you have a new status, right? So generally, let's ask this question. Let's say you've been working at your job. You've been punching that clock, right? You've been doing X, Y, or Z. And so your boss comes to you and says, Gerald, you have been working so hard. You've been doing a great job. And we are going to promote you. So we're going to pay you more money, however much money it is. Generally, with a change of status comes what? A reward, and then a responsibility, right? So your responsibility on your CV or on your resume is going to look different. And so you've got to be able to live in a certain way that's parallel with your status, right? Okay. So there's new status, and a new status then would require a new way of living. And because it's no longer that they're living here, but they're really existing where? They're really existing in a heavenly existence, which is odd for Paul to say that because we're still physical. Okay, so this is language of Paul that is, yes sir, please.
So that puts us not necessarily, as you were about to say, but I would say in the state of sanctification.
I would say that is certainly relevant. Yes. So we could almost say it like this. We have been sanctified, we are being sanctified, we will be sanctified, right? And there's a past, present, and future relevance to that, certainly, right? And so to your point, to your exact point, this is sometimes, and I think you dealt with this in Romans a lot because we see this in Romans, it's the already, but not yet. Yes, okay, this is very important to Paul's thought. So let me repeat that. It's the already, but not yet. So in highfalutin jargon that none of you care about, this is what we call inaugurated. What does inaugurated mean? If a president is inaugurated, what does that mean? Yeah, he starts his office, right? That's the first day he really becomes president, right? He starts, okay? It's called inaugurated, so it's something that you start. Eschatology, and that just means the end times. So what that means is, to your point exactly, is that we have begun living in the status of what it means to live in the very end. But it hasn't fully happened yet, has it? Because we're still waiting for it to finally happen. And that moment where the trumpet's going to sound, we're going to be changed. We're going to look like Jesus in a new way that none of us have any idea about. So we're still waiting for that moment, right? And that's going to be an awesome party, won't it? It's going to be awesome. It's going to be awesome. Okay, that's how I like to say it. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be incredible. But what's so important about this is that on some level that's already happened, right? Because according to 1 Corinthians 15, there's going to be a bodily resurrection. And I don't know how that's going to happen, but here we're told we've already been raised. Right? So when you became a Christian, you were raised in such a way, not only physically from the waters of baptism, but in a non-physical way where you are seated with Christ, according to Ephesians 2, 5, and 6. So your point exactly. It's something that's happened, is happening now, and will happen, right? Okay. So it's interesting that he's saying this has already occurred. This is already in the past. So it's interesting that we shouldn't have to say totally, hey, one day when that happens. Right? Because it's happened already. It's happened already. Okay. So that's a great point that you made. So the heavenly realm, this is one scholar, this is what he says about the heavenly realm. Because we're seeking things above, right? Isn't it interesting that we're seeking for something that we already have on some level? You see the irony there? So something that we have, but not fully. He says the heavenly realm, it centers around the one with whom they have been raised. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. It says you've been raised what? With Christ. You see that? It's not. So it's very important we see that. It's not something that happens in isolation. You see that? It's something that happens in communion with the risen Christ. He does it with us. So, with whom they have been raised, and since he is in the position of authority at God's right hand, nothing can prevent access to this realm and to God's presence. And there can be no insecurity about the salvation that they have in him, right? So notice it says this has been done. So you don't need to be worrying and worrying and worrying. Oh, maybe one day I'm going to make this mistake and it's going to just no, like God is more powerful than that, right? Okay, so they've been raised with Christ. And so what are they? What's the first major imperative here in 3:1?
Set your affections.
Yeah, you have set your affections? Okay, yes. Set your affections or seek. Seek, yeah. Either way you look at it, it's reorienting your mind. Right. Normally, isn't this interesting? Okay, so someone I'm telling me like the first grade definition. If we play a game of hide and seek, what is the object of that game? Yeah, it's for someone to go around looking for someone, and they don't know where they are, do they? Or there wouldn't be a purpose of the game, right? So does anybody see some irony here? We know where Christ is. Do you see that? That's very important. He's not saying, look for it because he's hidden and you can't find him and you got to hunt him down. It's saying, you know where he is, and so we're redirecting our minds and thinking about him and looking at him and looking for him. But it's not saying, oh, he's hard to find. That's not the point, right? We actually know where he is. Okay. So, seek the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Okay, let me get oriented here. Okay, and then, there we go. Yeah, I forgot to mention this, but Jesus makes a very similar statement. Anybody want to take a guess? It's actually in the Sermon on the Mount. We haven't gotten there yet, so that's why we haven't mentioned this. No? Ah, yes, we'll get there today. Chapter 633. 633. Seek and you will find. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine, yeah. He'll make an interesting statement. I don't know if Paul was intentionally mimicking this, but Jesus will make a statement and say, hey, if you'll seek, you'll find. Right? Seek first his kingdom. Okay, let me go a little further. I'm losing my... someone want to read from me Psalm 110, verse 1? I forgot to mention this. I want to talk about this for just a second. Anybody who wants to read that, you're welcome to read it. Whoever gets there is fine to read. Just loud and proud. Oh, my nose is running. Luckily, I got my handy dandy Kleenex here.
Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool.
Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe it's very likely he was thinking of this in a messianic sense, right? There was a Messiah who is to come, and David says, my Lord said to my Lord, right? So this is exaltation language. This is seated next to God, right? This is also a temple context as well. Okay. Okay, the next line in verse 2. What does that say? Yeah, so he says the first thing is you seek it, and then I suppose the implication would be once you have found it, then you're supposed to do what? Just think about it, right? There's a funny scene in a show I like, and they're all physicists, and this woman comes over to this guy's apartment, and she's reading this book, and she'd been there for hours. And the camera pans over to her, and she's just sitting awkwardly on the couch. And the character says, "Hey, are you okay? Like, you need something?" And she says, "Yeah, I finished reading my book." And he's like, "Okay." And she goes, "Now I'm thinking about what I read." So she's just sitting there. And I don't think that's what he's saying. But the things that are established and located where Christ is should be the focus of our minds. Right? That's what we should think about. And Paul will make another statement in Philippians 4, right? Whatever is true, whatever is lovely, whatever is above reproach, think about these things, right? So, just basically, from a very basic perspective, I think this requires us to think about what is it that the world is generally having for us to think about. What might some of those things be? Okay, so everything tied to self. Okay. Just on the way here, we were talking about a teacher Kristen and I had who has a law degree from Vandy. Very, 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 very impressive individual. And she said one of the reasons that she thinks she got out of law is because she recognized it's really difficult to be a Christian and be a lawyer. I don't think it's impossible. I'm not saying that. I know people who are lawyers who I believe are Christians. But it can be very difficult in the corporate world. And you know why that's the case? Because when you're a lawyer, often what you're thinking about is what? How I can ruin someone else's life. Okay? That's not always the case, and I don't want to paint too broad a brush there, because that's not always true, okay? But oftentimes in the corporate world, that's what they're thinking about, okay? And all I mean to say by that is, the world is always pulling for you to think about something else besides God. Right? So that means that there's a relationship that you have to maintain where you say, no, right? I'm not going to think about these things. That's not going to be entertaining my mind. Which requires what? That requires like rigorous discipline to control the way you think. Now, I think it's, you can control your body in a number of ways. You can eat a certain way, you can exercise a certain way, what your body does, but it's another thing to change the way you think about those things, right? So I know a lot of people who, let's say this is just practically speaking here, you think about if you're trying to if you're trying to lose weight or if you're trying to work out and you're trying to whatever, for months on end, you may say, I know I need to do this, but I hate it. Right? But I'll do it. I'll do the regimen, right? Whatever it is, I'll do it. But I hate every second of it, right? There's a difference between doing that and then having a conversation with yourself and saying, I love to exercise. I love eating well. I love going to the gym every day at 4:30 in the morning, which I know people who do this. What's the difference between the two? Yeah, the difference is the motivation because of the way I think, right? And that generally changes the way I act. So you can do the external thing, right? You can do that. You're going to hate every second of it. And it may not always be as effective, will it? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. That's a chance you'll have to take. But if I say, I'm going to change the way I think, and here's what I'm going to think about exercising all the time. I'm going to think about eating well all the time. That will change the way I live. Right? So their position, notice their position in heaven is meant to change the way they think. Okay? Does that make sense? I think it's very important. It's very basic. But I think it's pretty practical as well. I think we all understand that. And so oftentimes, the reason why people don't change the way they live is why? Because they're still being bombarded by the influence of the world, right? And so here in this passage, Paul is assuming, right, if you've died, since you've been raised, right? But a lot of people, maybe they haven't, okay? And maybe that's why their life isn't working, right? So, seeking things above means to contemplate divine, heavenly reality. You know? So what if every decision, this is very practical. What if every decision that I was making said, when I make this decision, I'm thinking about this decision impacts the way I will spend my eternity. Every single one. I'm not talking about the ones on Sunday. That's important too. Let's do that. But like when I pay my taxes, which is really difficult, I think about, okay, when I tip my waiter, I'm thinking about, I am resurrected with Christ, and I live with him as a co-resurrected spiritual being, okay? When I get in an argument with my friend or with my spouse or with my boss, I think, I'm a resurrected individual. What does that do to one's life? Yeah. Yeah. That's just humility, right? Yeah. So, there's just something to think about. Like, I think sometimes what we do is we agree with what Paul says here, but we don't think about what would happen if we took what Paul said to the logical extreme and we applied it to every aspect of our life. Because at the end of the day, that's very tiresome, isn't it? It's very tiresome when you say, at every point in my life, I'm going to think about the things above. Every point. And look, I am the worst at that. I am awful at it. Right? I don't think about that when me and Kristen talk about our taxes. I don't think about that when I'm mad. I don't think about that when someone cuts me off. I don't think about that when I'm watching football and someone throws a terrible pass. Like, I don't do that. But what if when we read these things, we're like, oh, if I did that all the time, like all the time, what would happen? And that's, I think, the challenge to that kind of a reality. Thinking about could mean develop an attitude based on careful thought. What does that mean? Yeah. Well, it's also interesting to see, what did Jesus do? And both of those things are important, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't ask, what would Jesus do? I think that's legitimately an excellent question. But the second one's also relevant. So, my attitude is, I just want us to think about, like, when you're in a business meeting, or when you're in traffic, or when someone does not do their job well, okay, when they're going to get laid off, or when something bad's about to happen, it takes extra discipline to separate yourself from that moment for just a second and be like, okay, I'm a Christian. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Do we see how difficult that might be to say, I'm about to have to act here in a high-stress situation, or in a situation in which I could be very distracted. It could be a number of things, right? It could be a moment where you're being tempted in a certain way, right? And you have to say, oh, wait. Right? So you have to press the pause button. And I'm thinking that's way more difficult than we all would like to admit. Yes, ma'am, please. That requires a lot of trust that he would help us do that, right? Yeah, I cannot do that on my own. I will fail every time. Every time. And it will be so easy. It won't be like, oh, I lasted for... No, it's just failure. Because I'm not trusting God at that point, right? And that's exactly right. So, I don't think this is meant to be easy. I don't think it is easy. And that's what trust is about, right? I think that's an excellent point. Develop an attitude based on careful thought. This is another scholar says this is a sustained effort of perspective. Okay, what does perspective mean? Normally when you say, you need to change your perspective, or what does that mean? Yeah, like, how do you view the situation? So, how are we gonna view life? Right? So when we walk out the door every day, we have an obligation to view the world a certain way, right? And view ourselves a certain way, and view the spiritual world a certain way, right? Something to think about. You must not only seek heaven. This is J.B. Lightfoot. He says, you must not only seek heaven, you must also think heaven. I think that's pretty good. So, you died, he says, for you died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. So now, you are so closely joined and so closely tied to Christ that what can be affirmed of Christ is now true in you, right? So your death is totally complete and it's totally final. And if we think about, if you're dead, physically dead, what's not going to happen? You're not coming back, okay? There's a couple of different layers to view it this way, but he's saying your death to sin is gone. You are gone, and there is no resurrection happening in that regard. Instead, the resurrection that happened was a different kind of life that had to happen because you died, right? So you died, like you're gone, like you're past and gone, you're buried, okay? So it's interesting because there's an ironic sense here that we're seeing both in Colossians and Ephesians. This is what Ephesians 2:1-10 is all about, is that we were dead in sin, but what that means for us is that we were brought back to life just to put our former way of life back to death, right? You're being brought back to life just to say, no, I'm not doing that again, right? So your life is hidden. Why do you think your life needs to be hidden? Typically speaking, unless we're playing a game, why do you think you hide things? Yeah, generally it's a protective measure. So, if you've got small children in the house, you're probably going to conceal. If you have firearms in the house, you're going to keep them away from children, right? If you've got medicine, you're going to put it on a high cabinet so your kids don't get in it. You're going to hide things to keep it safe, right? And I think that's what he's saying is dying and being raised with Christ protects you from the world. Now, it's interesting because I think sometimes we focus so much on worrying if I make a misstep outside of the lines that I'm immediately going to get whacked. I think part of this is saying when you trust God, your soul is being guarded by God. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go out and do whatever you want, but I do think it's also important to say I don't think that God is just out there willy-nilly just letting you just have a party and he doesn't care, right? So there's a balance between those two extremes. I don't want to be in the extremes, but he hides you in a way that protects you, right? Like that means God cares about you and wants you to thrive, right? This is really the outcome. This is the permanent outcome of rising with Christ, right? So you died and were risen, and your life is hidden away. It's also, I think it also implies, because it says, when Christ is revealed, who is your life, then you also will be revealed with him. What time is it? I got 1 minute. Typically, when you hide something, of course, it's out of sight. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that when you live as a Christian, people don't understand you. You're living in a way they're like, I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense to me. And that's a good thing. It shouldn't make sense. Because it doesn't. From the world's perspective, it doesn't make sense. And so your life is hidden in a way that says, like, the world, that's not what the world does. That's not what the world's about. That's not what the world does. So that's something to think about. It's not, this is one way of expressing it, it's not perceived by those who have not yet been led into the secret, and so is meaningless or folly to them. But then, let's say you've been hanging around a bunch of wackadoodles, and one of them finally comes to Christ. What's he going to say? What's he or she going to say to you? Oh, you mean that's what I was missing out on? You mean I was missing out on all that joy and comfort and peace and all of that security that I have in Christ? That makes a ton of sense. But people can't understand that if they're living like the world. So you're hidden. You're hidden from people of the world. And they don't understand you. That's why people make fun of Christians, is because they don't understand them. Right? So there's something to think about. You're hidden in that way. So the solution for the Colossians when they face attack is not to invoke angels for protection or deliverance, but to call on their God, is the way Arnold renders it. That's where we're going to have to stop. Y'all had some great comments. I appreciate that. And slowly but surely, we're getting through it. Appreciate it. Carolyn, I'm sorry I didn't get your bottle of water. Huh? Do you want one? Okay.
Ethiopian Bible.